While scandalous royals are by no means a thing of the past, these past royals just might take the cake for being the most scandalous throughout history. Ready to find out why? Starting off our list today, we have the former king of Denmark, Christian VII, a man who spent pretty much his entire life acting like a child. Christian took to the throne at just 16 years of age in 1766, during which time he caused many a scandal and much chaos for his royal family members as well as his wife, his staff, and his people. Some of Christian's crazy quirks included inviting important guests and dignitaries to dinner parties, and then when the dignitaries greeted him and bowed, the king would hop over their backs as though he was engaging in a game of leapfrog. And once everyone was seated for dinner and the food was served, the young king would begin flinging the menu items around the room at his dinner guests. After marrying his cousin just 1 year after taking the throne, Christian would often run through the streets of his kingdom with his mistress, patronizing local shops and brothels in drunken fits of bad behavior. It is also said that at one point in time the young king built his own torture rack and ordered people to tie him to the device and flog him in some sort of strange pursuit of pleasure. Next up on our list today we have Emperor Zheng, another young ruler who partook in some pretty strange behaviors while in power. At the age of just 14, Zheng became the 11th emperor of the Ming dynasty in 1505 and ruled until he passed at the age of 29 in 1521. Uninterested in being a ruler at such a young age, an uninterest that would remain all the way into adulthood, the emperor assigned eunuchs to all positions of power and allowed them to run the government in his place. While ignoring his duties, the young ruler engaged in various lavish and outlandish behaviors and activities, which were paid for by the tax dollars of his people. If you are thinking that this is already sounding pretty bad, listen up, because one of Zheng's all-time favorite activities was raiding the homes of the wealthy, kidnapping their daughters, and then demanding a ransom for the girl's safe return. And anyone who disputed this reckless behavior was arrested, tortured, and executed. And as you can imagine, there were a lot of people who disputed this behavior. The terror did eventually come to a fitting end when in 1505 the emperor's pleasure barge capsized and Zheng drowned in the chaos. After his death, the eunuchs, which had been placed in charge of running China's government, had garnered so much power within political structures that even new rulers of the dynasty were unable to remove the eunuchs from their positions. Next up, we've got Catherine the Great, Empress of Russia, who, in all fairness, was a pretty good ruler. In fact, some might even say great. The scandal here really lies in her, extracurricular appetite. Catherine, originally named Sophie, was born in Germany but moved to Russia after marrying her husband Peter III in 1745. It was said that Peter had much less of an appetite, and he often disregarded his wife's company for that of toy soldiers and imaginary worlds. Thus began Catherine's spiral into sexual insatiability. In 1796, one of Catherine's many lovers murdered Peter, and she took her position as Empress of Russia. After stepping into power at the age of 33, her desires for the company of men only grew, and she was by no means frugal towards her lovers either, gifting one with 1,000 laborers and declaring another king of Poland, who she eventually declared war against after a pretty fierce lover's spat in which Catherine accused him of being unobedient. The story of Catherine's death has been quite disputed over the years, but one version tells that she met her end during a zealous rendezvous with a palace horse. Historians, however, maintain that she suffered a stroke on the toilet and died the following day, which is the most likely but a far less interesting explanation for sure. Next up, we have Justin II, Emperor of Byzantium. Which at its peak included modern-day Italy, Greece, Turkey, as well as some portions of North Africa and the Middle East. During Justin's rule from 1565 to 1578 AD, he was prone to acting up. He was known for constantly trying to bite officials of the court, making animal noises at passersby, and hitting people at random, unprovoked times. Many officials of the court would take turns pulling the mad emperor around the castle in a wagon in an attempt to calm his nerves, but unfortunately all efforts proved futile and people began to speculate that Justin was possessed by the devil. It was at this time that his wife Sophia, who was taking care of him, became kind of like a regent, making many political decisions on his behalf. behalf. From possessed by the devil to worshipping it, we have Marquise de Montespan, who is accused of just that after she caused a whole lot of trouble way back in the late 16 and early 1700s. You see, although both the Marquise and the King of France, Louis XIV, were married, the two had sparked up an affair for the ages, and they weren't exactly subtle about it either, with the king on many occasions showering the Marquise with intricate gifts and spending more time with her than his actual wife, Marie Therese of Austria. It appears, however, that much like Catherine the Great, Marquise became insatiable, infatuated with the king's attention, and she wished to become queen herself. Marquise de Montespan divorced her husband and began spending more time with the queen in an attempt to assess the situation and figure out her next best steps, during which time she also befriended a Parisian witch. Together, the witch and the Marquise began cooking up love potions made from the bones of some incredibly vulnerable members of society. It was this gruesome feat that led many to believe Marquise had turned to devil worship in the first place. Everything began to fall apart in 1679 after many members of the court experienced poisoning, and the two women came under investigation. The witch was burnt at the stake, while Marquise ran for the hills, in which she ironically spent the rest of her days living in a convent. Next up, we have Peter the Great, who was a pretty interesting guy, but unlike Catherine, he wasn't really all that great, or all that liked by the Russian people, over which he kept rule. While he has been credited with leading widespread reforms that led Russia to become one of the leading powers in Europe, he was less than empathetic in regards to his subjects. John Evelyn, an author in the 1600s, recounted a time he had invited Peter to stay in his home, saying that the Tsar of Russia, along with an entourage, trashed the author's place, destroying portraits and priceless family heirlooms, tearing apart the gardens, and soiling at least 12 blankets. Whatever that means. Perhaps though the strangest thing that Peter did was implement a beard tax, in which he required the country's residents to either shave their faces or pay a fine for their insubordination. His members of staff, however, were not given this option and instead were lined up to have their faces shaved by Peter himself. It is important to note that during this time it was believed by Russia's Orthodox Church that having a bare face was a sin and went against God, but Peter insisted, saying that the new look was a necessary sacrifice in order to keep up with the trends of the more advanced Western Europeans. Next up, we've got King Charles VI, who ruled France from 1380 to 1422. It seems in 1392 the king suffered from a high fever and convulsions, which apparently was the beginning of his downfall, as directly after the illness, Charles began slowly slipping into insanity. He experienced bouts of paranoia and rage, which caused him to become a danger to anyone around him during the episodes. Perhaps his strangest symptom, however, was the reoccurring belief that his entire body was made of glass. And when this delusion occurred, he would refuse to move for hours on end, terrified of breaking. It even got so bad that at one point he had to be cut out of his clothes after neglecting his hygiene and refusing to change for days out of fear that he might simply shatter. Next on our list today, we have Justinian II, not to be mistaken with Justin II. Justinian II ruled Byzantium in the year 685 AD. In another great example of why children should not be given such high positions of power, at the age of just 16, Justinian took to the throne with a brutality-soaked iron fist, murdering those who served him out of spite for losing battles, persecuting religious minorities, and imposing high taxes on his people in order to pay for armies and buildings are only a few of the many horrible acts performed by Justinian that eventually led to the people turning on him. I guess at some point his subjects became so sick of his terror that they started an uprising to overthrow his rule, during which they forcefully slit his tongue and cut off his nose in order to deter him from ever seeking to regain the throne. Justinian eventually replaced his nose with a gold prosthetic and, much to the public's dismay, did reclaim the throne in 1705 and ruled until 1711 when he was killed by mutinous soldiers. I mean, they did kinda warn him. Next up, we have Joanna of Castille, the former queen of Castile and Aragon, also known as Joanna the Mad. She came into power in Castile in 1504 and gained control of Aragon in 1516, the union of which led to the evolution of modern-day Spain. On October 20th of 1496, Joanna had married Philip I of Burgundy, son of the Holy Roman Empire. When Joanna first stepped into the throne in 1504, all seemed well. It wasn't until around 2 years later when it appeared she began to unravel. You see, Joanna, who had 6 children by Philip, loved her husband. In fact, she loved him so much that when he died in the year 1506, she couldn't bear the idea of living without him by her side, and so she figured out a way to avoid having to. After his death, Joanna had Philip embalmed and then ordered him to be kept with her at all times. She refused to be separated from her late husband, keeping him in her room, sleeping next to him, and even taking him along on long journeys. All of this strange behavior led royal family members as well as the public to declare Joanna unfit to rule, and so her and Philip's son Charles eventually took on the role of regent, allowing his mother to live out her days with her deceased husband and taking on the role of the true leader of Spain. And finally, to finish us off today, we have Mustafa I, former Sultan of the Ottoman Empire, which in its heyday stretched from the Balkans and southeastern Europe all the way to Anatolia, Central Asia, Arabia, and North Africa. In 1603, Mustafa's older brother Ahmed claimed the throne at the young age of 13. In accordance with Ottoman culture at the time, Ahmed was told to execute his brother so that Mustafa may never attempt to take the throne out from under him. Luckily, or unluckily, I'm not really sure, Ahmed refused to take the life of his brother, but instead locked him in a windowless prison cell until Ahmed eventually passed away, at which time Mustafa was forced to step up and assume the throne. Unfortunately, however, by this point in time, after having spent many years in maddening solitude, Mustafa was in no way fit to rule, and was soon replaced by his nephew Osman. When Osman passed shortly after his coronation, Mustafa was once again instated as ruler. This time, however, he refused to leave his cage, and so he had to be physically removed and placed on the throne. Mustafa spent his second rule feverishly scouring the castle for Osman, believing the former king to still be alive and begging him to come back to the throne. Eventually, this became too much for the people to handle, and once again Mustafa was removed from his position of power and sent back to his prison, where he later died of a seizure due to madness in 1693. Oh my gosh, you guys, history honestly never fails to leave me speechless. I really hope you enjoyed our video for today. I've been your host, Hannah Thompson, and together we're keeping the history present.